Note that while one major benefit of nested conditionals is that we can take care of more combinations of conditions, another benefit is that in many ways this code is more readable. Take a look right here. Remember how before when we used a bunch of ands to combine these together, we had to break our line of code into multiple lines just to be able to fit it onto the screen at one time? With these nested conditionals, we no longer have to do that. Now granted, we're splitting it into multiple lines anyway, but those multiple lines are a little bit more readable. That's because here we have 3 short, concise conditional statements. Each of them is indented under the previous one, meaning that each one only runs if the previous one was in fact true. That means the purchase is only approved if the first conditional and the second conditional and the third conditional are all true, because if the first conditional wasn't true, the second 2 wouldn't even get checked. So it's functionally equivalent to our previous statement. The result will always be identical. However, the other benefit here is that each individual one of these conditionals can have their own dedicated else. Remember, each else automatically corresponds to the immediately preceding if at the same level of indentation. And so each of these else statements corresponds to one of those if statements. What that means is that our print statements can vary based on the reason why the purchase failed. So looking at our previous example, the first several lines of code once again set up our variables and their values, and then the conditional on line 14 runs. Notice here that I've changed the vendor. I've changed it to Freddy's. Freddy is not one of our trusted vendors. So we would expect this to fail due to an untrusted vendor. Line 14 checks to see if the balance is greater than the purchase price times the sales tax, or overdraft protection is enabled. Once again, the balance is 20 and the purchase price is 19 and sales tax is 1.08. And so balance is not going to be big enough to actually make the purchase. But because overdraft protection is on, this entire statement ends up being true. It's true that either the balance is sufficient or overdraft protection is enabled, because overdraft protection is true. Now because line 14, that conditional, was true, execution of our code jumps into the indented block. If it wasn't true, it would skip over it. The first line of the indented block is line 15, which checks to see if the cardholder name equals the customer name. That hasn't changed. They're both still David Joyner. And so this condition is also true. So once again, it then jumps into the indented code block and runs line 16. Line 16 says if vendor is in the list of trusted vendors. But as I mentioned, Freddy's is not. We have Maria's, Bob's, Rashali's, Ling's, and Tia's, but Freddy's is not one of our trusted vendors. So this conditional is false. As a result, line 17 will be skipped, and the else on line 18 will be triggered. Line 19 will run, and our output will be purchase not approved, untrusted vendor. The reason is because that else statement that was triggered corresponded directly to the if statement regarding the vendor. Now that's the end of this indented block, and so execution of the code automatically jumps to the previous block. Here on line 20 we see an else, but the if that else corresponded to was true. And so this else doesn't need to trigger. This if was the one that said if the cardholder is the same as the customer, which was true. And so that block is already run. No need to run the else that follows that particular if. And so line 21 is also skipped. Then once again, that's the end of this interior indented block of code. And so we jump back to the outside. Now we check the else on line 22. It corresponds to the if on line 14, which was true. Because that one was true, line 23 won't run. And then finally the code concludes with line 24, which prints that we're done. So there were a couple benefits here. One was that these lines of code were more easily readable. They're very short, simple logical expressions that anyone can read one by one to find out what happens. And probably more importantly, we then had dedicated feedback based on the reason why a particular transaction failed. We can actually see if it was because the cardholder wasn't valid, the vendor wasn't trusted, or there wasn't enough money in the account, or overdraft protection wasn't enabled. That's what we get from this kind of nested conditional. Each conditional is inside a previous conditional. And so it's as if we're using an AND operator between all of them, but yet we preserve the ability to have a dedicated else for each individual expression.